Good morning. It is Sunday, which means it's time for another edition of At Issue. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Coming up, my conversations with former Boston Mayor Kim Janey and Michael Curry on the 50th anniversary of the Boston busing crisis.
Plus, Congressman Seth Moulton is going to join us in a minute to talk about what else? The election, which is just over 5 weeks away. But first, let's see what was at issue over the past week.
The Senate voted to hold the CEO of Stewart Healthcare in contempt of Congress for defying a congressional subpoena.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams has officially been charged with bribery and wire fraud.
The MBTA is getting almost $500 million in federal funding for the North Station Draw 1 bridge replacement.
The government shutdown has been averted. Last night, Congress voted to approve a stopgap funding bill to keep things running until December.
The man arrested near Trump's golf course earlier this month has officially been charged with attempting to assassinate the president.
Mayor Michelle Wu, she was the featured pianist at this weekend's free Boston Symphony Orchestra concert.
So much happening here. And of course, in the Middle East, Israel appears to be on the brink of a full-blown war with the militant group Hezbollah.
The Israeli military has already struck more than 2,000 targets in Lebanon. The IDF says nearly 100 of those strikes were on Hezbollah intelligence sites. Of course, this follows Israel's sabotage of thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies that killed at least 12 people, including 2 kids, and wounded thousands more.
The U.S. is trying to broker a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah and restart those stalled ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
So where does that leave Israel's biggest ally, the United States? Joining us to talk about that and so much more, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton. Congressman, thank you so much for being back here on At Issue. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to ignore calls for restraint from the Biden administration and other Western allies, and we now stand at the precipice of all-out war. Where is the breaking point here? Do you think the United States' unequivocal support for Israel has emboldened the prime minister? It seems like he's somewhat banking on U.S. supporting Israel should the region fall into all-out war.
Well, I mean, in some ways, that's our national security challenge at the moment, because it is not in our interest to be drawn into a major war in the Middle East. Yes, we are against terrorism. Yes, we stand by our democratic ally, Israel. We also stand by the civilians that are getting killed on both sides of this conflict. And we don't want innocent civilians killed. We don't want a wider war in the Middle East. And that's why the Biden administration is urging restraint.
So the region, of course, very complicated. Israel at war with Hamas and Hezbollah, 2 militant groups that are backed by Iran. And as this conflict continues to grow, how concerned are you that Iran's presence will grow in the region?
It's a serious concern, and we need a clear Iran strategy. It's something that I've been talking to a lot of folks about. It's a very difficult situation with Iran because Donald Trump pulled us out of the nuclear deal that showed us a path forward with diplomacy. The deal wasn't perfect, but it laid the groundwork for future negotiations and gave us a clear path to actually empower the moderates in Iran, including many of the Iranian people who do not support this kind of international terrorism, who are actually very pro-American. But now it's harder to know what to do. We need to make sure that Iran knows that we will respond forcefully to any attacks, but we also don't want to empower the hardliners in Iran. Sometimes if we have military action against them, it just gives credibility to the Iranian leaders who are saying that America is the evil empire. They need to take action across the Middle East. So the point is, this is a complicated problem with Iran. We don't have a very clear long-term strategy. That's not the Biden administration's fault. It's frankly the Trump administration's fault for getting us in this mess. But nonetheless, it's a tinderbox in the Middle East. Our national security focus should be on China in the Pacific. And so we do not want to get drawn into a wider war in the Middle East.
We know the prime minister spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, and as he was doing that, there were strikes in Lebanon. There are reports that a ground invasion could be imminent. Going back to my first question, when it comes to U.S. support, is there a breaking point here? Is there a situation where you tell Prime Minister Netanyahu, we cannot go with you on this as you continue to move forward?
Well, although I can't speak for the administration, there is a breaking point for support with any ally around the globe. I mean, there are things that our closest allies in the world ask for that we don't always deliver if we don't think it's in our national security interest. So those conversations are ongoing. I mean, understand that Israel has this serious problem where 100,000 of their citizens are displaced from the northern border region because they are under continual rocket attack from Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, to be clear, is not just targeting the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, they're targeting Israeli civilians. Israel, in response, is saying, Hezbollah, you need to pull back. There was actually a diplomatic agreement to have a buffer zone that Hezbollah has not honored. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah is about 10 times as strong as Hamas in Gaza. So I'm not sure it's in Israel's interest to have an all-out war with Hezbollah. And we've already seen some disturbing numbers about civilian casualties in Beirut and surrounding areas. I have friends who live in Lebanon. A lot of my constituents have concerns or family members there. So we're all watching carefully and urging a diplomatic solution to this conflict that restores people to their homes, Israelis who want to be able to live in their homes and send their kids to school, eliminates this terrorist threat, but also avoids a wider war.
Last question on this. Would it be hyperbole to say we could be looking at the potential of troops on the ground, U.S. troops on the ground, I mean?
We're doing everything we can to avoid that. We don't want to get drawn into a war because it distracts our attention, but of course, because it could cost American lives. We've already lost too many Americans in the Middle East. We don't want to start that again.
Obviously, this issue is also a major force in the race for the White House, so let's pivot and go there next. You were among the first Democratic members of Congress to ask President Biden to end his reelection campaign, while many others were silent. Looking at where we are now with the Democratic candidate, a new one, a race that's neck and neck, in the final days of Joe Biden's political career, when you look back, it was a political risk for you to speak up. Do you feel vindicated about what you did?
Oh, absolutely. But I don't care about vindication. I mean, I just did what I thought was right. I spoke my mind. And look, this is like the greatest political turnaround in American history. The bottom line is that Joe Biden was going to lose to Donald Trump. And that's not an acceptable result. Kamala Harris is doing extraordinarily well. The race is neck and neck, but the ground that she's made up is really incredible. I mean, she's in a neck and neck race where Biden was losing and getting worse. And she's got a lot of opportunity, I think, ahead of her, because the more that people learn about her, the more that people learn about her policies, her numbers keep going up. A good example is the economy. And Trump was leading Biden by something like 20 points on the economy. Kamala has closed that gap by about half, and she's releasing more details of her economic plan. So the vice president is on a path to win in this race. But to be clear, it is still very close.
What made your call for the president to step aside so poignant? Of course, you have a very personal relationship with President Biden, in large part due to your military service. When you called on him to step aside, you wrote about that encounter you had with the president at a D-Day ceremony, I believe, which you said he didn't seem to recognize you. Have you spoken to the president since he decided to drop out? And if not, do you feel that there has maybe been some damage done to your relationship?
Well, I haven't heard from him, and so maybe that means there's some damage done. But at the end of the day, I think President Biden knows that he did the right thing for the country by stepping aside. And he's a very, very busy man. He's got an awful lot on his plate, so I don't expect him to, take time out of his day to just call me. But I think at the end of the day, we all know that he made the right decision. And so whatever rifts there were between members of Congress like myself and the president and his administration, I think those will heal over time.
So as you mentioned, Vice President Harris has been able to really excite the base of the party and draw independents to her side, but she is struggling, according to some polls, with two groups specifically, non-college educated white men and black men. What do you think she can do to get their support, or do you think she should just cut her losses in those categories and look for a different type of voter, like maybe white suburban women or some of those Nikki Haley voters?
Look, I think that all Americans have an interest in voting for Vice President Harris, so I don't think she should just focus on one group or another. But much has been made of the fact that there are a lot of men who say they won't vote for her. Look, the simplest answer to that question is that It's because she's a woman. And the sad reality in America today is that there still is a lot of sexism. We see this in the workplace. We see it in politics. We've never had a woman president of the United States. So there's some discrimination going on here, and that's part of her challenge. But I also think that Democrats as a party can do more to speak to the concerns of men in America. And there are a lot of people who feel like the party is more interested in identity politics or, the next greatest social issue, whatnot, rather than addressing the real economic concerns. The fact that there are a lot of men struggling to put food on the table. There are a lot of men who haven't seen their wages go up. Of course, this applies to women as well, but the party, I think, as a whole can do more to speak to these constituencies. And I've certainly been encouraging the vice president to do that. I think you'll hear her do that as she releases more of her economic plan and talks about what an impact it will have on American families in the coming weeks of this campaign.
Congressman, is that what you meant when you criticized the Democratic Party, saying it's the party of the ultra-rich and the ultra-poor and losing the folks in the middle?
That's part of it. Yes, exactly. That I think we've sadly become a little bit out of touch with many people in America. And, we're the party of these great causes and everything, but let's not lose touch with the people that we're here to represent. I think there are segments of our party that have done that. I think in some ways, Vice President Harris gets unfairly blamed for, the left wing of our party. She's actually quite moderate when you get to know her. She has taken some very left-wing positions in the past, but she's been willing to change her mind. I think as more Americans see who she really is and recognize that she comes from a middle-class background, she's faced some of the same struggles that many Americans do today. I go to the grocery store with my kids on the weekend, and I can see grocery prices are high. That's a great example of an issue that she's addressing. You haven't heard Donald Trump say anything about grocery prices. God knows he doesn't do his own shopping. But for those of us who do, we know this is an issue, and Vice President Harris is working to address it.
Representative, you're a veteran, and you've worked for years to recruit more veterans to run for political office, and you've supported a lot in their campaigns. For the first time in almost 2 decades, we have veterans on both parties' tickets, right? In a Wall Street Journal op-ed, you criticized J.D. Vance's integrity. In a podcast, you also called him, quote, a combat correspondent. And some have accused you of attacking his service. How do you square your support for veterans with your criticism of Vance, who's a fellow veteran who's on the campaign trail?
Sure. No, that's a good question, and I'm happy to explain. First of all, he is a combat correspondent. That's a job that he did in the Marine Corps, so that's not something I just called him or whatnot. That's a job that he chose to do. And, there are a lot of jobs in the military that are important, but I think that for him to get on a high horse and criticize Tim Walz for his service is quite a bit much. When I talked about J.D. Vance's integrity, I talked about the fact that, integrity is a core value that you learn when you show up for the Marine Corps. When you go to training, you'll learn literally on day one that, you can fall out of a run, you'll probably get to try again the next day. You can fail a test and you'll probably get to have a chance to retake it. But if you lie about anything, you're out. And J.D. Vance, if you look at his record, he was one of the biggest, staunchest critics of Donald Trump. He called him the most awful things, said that he disagreed with all of his policies, was ruining the Republican Party. And then all of a sudden he turns coat, decides to support Donald Trump, do basically whatever he asks. And that's just not integrity. I'm sorry. That's just not basic integrity and honesty, which I think is something that we should expect from someone who wants to be vice president of the United States.
All right, finally, Congressman, September is Mental Health Awareness Month. We know you've been an outspoken advocate for more service for behavioral health, especially for veterans. Sadly, we know suicide rates remain high. Nearly 20 veterans die by suicide every day. Advocates for veteran mental health say non-traditional sorts of treatment, like pairing veterans with service dogs, has had a positive effect. And some veterans that we've spoken to have said psychedelics help. As you know, it's a ballot question here in Massachusetts. Let's listen to one veteran told us.
This has really afforded me the opportunity to turn my life around. Once I tried it, I couldn't believe it. I had this moment of clarity, like that I must be onto something here. Really, it is like a moment of clarity when you do this, but it's something that sticks with you. It's not just a moment.
So that was a Marine Corps vet telling us about his experience using psychedelics as therapy. What are your thoughts on this sort of treatment? Are you worried that some veterans may try something that scientists are still exploring the risks and benefits of?
Well, I think that's a concern, but I've heard this from a lot of veterans, frankly, who tried psychedelics or even just using marijuana, because frankly, many of them see that as a safer alternative to some of the high-powered opioids that they get prescribed from the VA. So for years now, I have encouraged the VA to at least do the science, study this. I mean, there's a federal law against using marijuana. I disagree with that. But the point is that veterans are using it anyway, so you should at least do the science to see what the effects are, to understand how it interacts with other medications, and to understand fundamentally if it's a good treatment for post-traumatic stress. I think we should take the same approach to psychedelics. There are some encouraging anecdotal reports of how this works. We need to do the science, and at the end of the day, get treatments out to veterans that make a difference in their lives.
Well, certainly the ballot question could have a major impact on that research and its use for therapy. Congressman, thank you so much for being here on At Issue. We really do appreciate it.
Great to see you.
All right, up next, a look back at Boston's busing crisis with city leaders who lived through that ugly period.
The back of the bus pushes some people to the front of the movement. So when you've experienced what we experienced with busing or the injustices and inequities in Boston, you tend to move differently.
I spoke with Michael Curry and former Mayor Kim Janey about what they went through 50 years ago this month. What they told me is next.
Welcome back to At Issue. This month marks a difficult anniversary in Boston. 50 years since the busing crisis that tore apart neighborhoods.
A federal judge, Arthur Garrity, found that the city's school committee perpetuated segregation in schools and spent less money in mostly black neighborhoods. To address it, he issued an order on June 21st, 1974 to desegregate Boston schools by bus. The ruling led to protests and racial violence.
Sue, you recently caught up with two city leaders who were bused as children.
That's right. Former Boston Mayor Kim Janey was 11 years old when she was bused to Charlestown to the Edwards Middle School. The Edwards was recently closed. The building now houses the Horace Mann School and a pre-K program. I met her there to talk about that ugly piece of Boston history.
For the children on that school bus, a very scary and traumatic time to see angry mobs, what felt like hundreds of people who were angry, who were cursing, who were throwing things, who had sticks, bottles, rocks, obviously using the N-word.
The effort here was to bring better education and equal education to everyone. I haven't talked to anyone who said it succeeded on any of those issues at that time. What pushed this idea forward?
I recently found a document that had a number of points that parents were fighting for. Not one of those points was around busing. It was around getting more diversity in terms of school leadership, getting permanent teachers in our classroom, reducing class size, getting more books and resources, all of the things that we know can help contribute to quality. But instead, we got a court order that determined where kids were going to go to school.
Michael Curry is another city leader who was among those students on the bus. Michael has dedicated over 20 years of service to the NAACP. He was president of the Boston branch and now is president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. Michael was just 7 when he was bused from his home in Roxbury to the Warren Prescott Elementary School in Charlestown.
I remember being on the bus. I remember ducking down and the rocks pelting the bus. I remember peeking out to see the police escorts and the line of people in the streets looking angry and yelling. Didn't really understand what they were saying because I was 7 at the time. But what I remember most is my mother's fear. And now that I think back, my mother wouldn't have thought herself as an activist, but I think that was an act of activism to put your child on a bus, to send them to a place you know that there was danger, to make a point, to get them a better education.
Can you talk about the trauma that busing did on the entire city?
Yeah, you know, I think people forget kind of the powder keg that was in existence at that time. You'd already had almost a decade of activism about desegregation, inequities in the schools. You had parents and activists in the streets 1965 through early 1970s. We were in the middle of a recession. People forget that. So Southie had high unemployment rates. There was tension with families in Southie and Roxbury. There was the juxtaposition between two communities that had a lot in common, but yet we're divided over race, and that we had politicians who played on race to get elected and to be favored by their communities. So it kind of pitted communities against each other. But the reality is the goal, we have to remember what the goal was, that all students get access to a quality education.
Has anyone apologized to you? No one ever has apologized? No leaders that were involved in this?
No.
Is that shocking?
No, sadly, it's not. And no one has apologized to me, but I don't even think there's been a public apology from a leader. Whether they directly apologize to me is less important than just acknowledging what happened here. I mean, it was very violent and very traumatic and continues to impact education today. There are families, again, who have been traumatized by that experience, who won't set foot in a school building.
The reality is the way we treat history, both in Massachusetts, Boston, across the country, is people get to fall back in the shadows, right? And they never tell the story. Families don't talk about it. Communities don't talk about it. And there's a lot of history we don't unpack. Busing is one of those. I'm curious whether progress has been there or whether they still harbor animosity, whether they're still trying to protect what they thought they were protecting in Charlestown or Southie.
A few years ago, you reached out on social media to folks who had been involved in the busing crisis. What did you hear back?
One student shared how every day they walked into school, the white students would taunt them and throw things at them as they walked into school, and they had to be measured. They had to be calm, because if they had fought back, the narrative would be that they were the violent one. So imagine a 11, 12, 13-year-old having to navigate the politics of that you can't even defend yourself. And even if you did defend yourself, maybe the teachers wouldn't defend you or come to your rescue. What I got out of that feedback from social media was how people have been waiting for a chance to share their story. And arguably, with all the trauma and experiences we have in this world, people probably could use some therapeutic support, some therapy, to actually sit down and process what they went through, and then look at what the manifestations have been in their lives, what neighborhoods they don't go to, right? What relationships they've not forged with communities or people because of those experiences.
When I learned that you had been bused, and then when you became mayor of Boston, I kind of internalized, well, if I was an 11-year-old on that bus, I too would be saying, I'm going to be running the city at some point. I'm going to keep my head straight and I'm going to go forward. What's the emotion? How has this impacted your drive, your ability to put your career in service?
It was maybe in large part because of that experience here at this school that my very first day as mayor of Boston, this is where I came. I came here, and it's really to turn a page, to say, but we can't, it's easy to say we're turning a page. We've got to be willing to do the hard work that will get us beyond hurt feelings.
If people always ask me why I do what I do, right? Civil rights, social justice work. And there's a phrase that I think applies to this conversation around busing. I say the back of the bus pushes some people to the front of the movement. So when you've experienced what we experienced with busing, or the injustices and inequities in Boston, you tend to move differently, right? You choose jobs differently, you volunteer differently. So I think there are many people like me, parents like my mother and Mayor Janey, former Mayor Janey, and others who went through busing and decided we wanted to be part of the solution and spend a life doing that.
Some people point to how much money gets spent in the Boston public school system, but still not getting the quality education that the students need in order to compete in this world. What's your take on what needs to happen next in order to move the Boston public school system?
So now, for generations, we've had a underfunded public education system where students still didn't have the adequate books, the technology, the buildings. And so the reality is we still have students that are underperforming because we've not given them the tools to perform. So we have to crack the code on it, and cracking the code on it means also solving for the social determinants of poor education, right? We say social determinants of health, poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, racism, because if those things don't get solved, that student still won't be that phenomenal physician that we expect him or her to become. because they can't get past those other barriers, impediments to their success.
We have a lot of work to do, and our kids are depending on us to step up, to use this anniversary as a way to kind of not just do the reflection, but to really put a plan forward that gets us beyond a segregated city and segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools that lack the quality that so many parents need and our children deserve.
50 years later, you can tell the trauma is still fresh, which is why it is so important to have conversations just like that. Our thanks to Kim Janey and Michael Curry for joining us, and to Dan Farragon, who shot and edited that story. Thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. For Sue O'Connell, I'm Corey Smith. Enjoy the rest of your day.